The letter arrived on a Tuesday, but the man who sent it had been dead for 3 months. That was the first lie. Eleanor Ashcroft stood at the window of the eastbound train as it slowed toward the tiny Texas station, watching the crowd gathered on the platform below. And she immediately understood that every single one of them had come not to welcome her, but to watch her fail. Word travels fast in small towns, and apparently the news that Silas Granger had sent away for a mail-order bride had been the most entertaining thing to hit Caldwell Creek since the grain elevator caught fire in 1887. She could hear them laughing before the wheels even stopped turning. But before she could steady herself, before she could pull her coat straight or lift her chin the way her mother had taught her, a man in the crowd, barrel-chested and red-faced, cupped both hands around his mouth and shouted something that cut through the platform noise like a knife through cheap cotton. "Lord Almighty, Silas! You ordered a bride and they sent you a buffalo!" The laughter exploded. Not nervous laughter, not polite laughter that people cover their mouths for. The kind that bends grown men at the waist, the kind that makes women grab each other's arms. Eleanor did not move. She stood perfectly still at that window, and for 3 full seconds she let herself feel exactly how much it hurt. Then she picked up her bag. If you've ever been judged the moment you walked into a room, before you said a single word, before anyone knew your name, then you already know something about Eleanor Ashcroft. And if you stay with me until the very end of this story, I promise you, the woman those people laughed at that afternoon would go on to change every single one of their lives forever. This is not a story about getting even. It's a story about what gets revealed when everything else gets stripped away. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that train platform in Texas, 1889. Because what you just saw, that was only the very beginning. The town of Caldwell Creek, Texas, had seen hard times before Eleanor ever set foot in it. 3 consecutive drought years had turned the surrounding land the color of old bone. Cattle prices had dropped twice in 4 years, and half the ranching families who'd been there since before the war were now selling off parcels just to keep their children fed through winter. The men who remained were proud in the way that desperate people become proud, loudly, defensively, and sometimes cruelly, because pride was the one thing the drought hadn't managed to take yet. Silas Granger was 41 years old and had not laughed at anything in longer than he could honestly remember. He was not a cruel man. He was not even, by Caldwell Creek standards, an unreasonable one. But he had been alone with a 6-year-old daughter for 3 years since his wife Margaret died of fever, and the ranch was coming apart at the seams in ways he didn't have enough hours in the day to address. The fencing needed repair. The books needed attention he didn't have the education to give them. Hazel needed someone who could be there in the mornings when he was already 2 miles out checking the western pasture, and someone who could hold her when the nightmares came, which they still did, twice, sometimes 3 times a week. He had written the letter to the agency in Philadelphia with his hat in his hands, metaphorically speaking. He was not a man who asked for help easily. The letter had taken him 4 drafts over 6 days, and the final version said almost nothing about himself. What it said, mostly, was this: I have a daughter who is lonely, and I need a good woman who will be kind to her. Everything else can be figured out. He had not asked for beauty. He had not asked for youth. He had not specified much of anything, because he'd learned enough about life by then to know that the things you specify are rarely the things that matter. What he had not anticipated was the whole town showing up to watch. He found out later it was Charlie Briggs who'd spread the word. Charlie, who worked the telegraph office and had loose enough lips that most private correspondence in Caldwell Creek was effectively public knowledge within 48 hours of arrival. By the time Tuesday morning came and the 10:15 from San Antonio pulled into the station, there were at least 60 people on that platform who had absolutely no business being there. Silas stood near the back of the crowd with Hazel's hand in his, and he felt the particular embarrassment of a private man whose private business had become public entertainment. Hazel was wearing her good dress, the blue one with the white collar that he'd pressed badly the night before. There were still creases in the wrong places, and she was holding a small bunch of wildflowers she'd picked herself that morning, dried out some from sitting in her fist for 2 hours. "Is that the train, Daddy?" she asked. "That's the train." "Is she on it?" "Should be." Hazel considered this with the intense seriousness that 6-year-olds apply to important occasions. What if she doesn't like me? Silas looked down at her. She'll like you. But what if she'll like you, Hazel? He said it more firmly than he meant to, and she went quiet, and he felt immediately guilty about that too. He was not particularly good at the soft moments. He knew it. Margaret had been the one who was good at those. The train slowed. Steam rolled across the platform. The crowd pushed forward the way crowds do. Not quite rudely, but not politely either. That particular human instinct to position yourself for the best view of something you expect to be interesting. The first passengers off were two cattle buyers Silas recognized, then a young family with too much luggage, then an older minister type with a black coat. And then the laughter started before she'd finished stepping down. It started with Charlie Briggs, because of course it did, and the buffalo comment landed like a stone in a pond, the ripples spreading outward until it seemed like the whole platform was shaking with it. Silas felt his face go hot. He saw Eleanor Ashcroft clearly for the first time, a large woman, broad-shouldered, dressed plainly in dark green wool that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back without particular artistry. She was not young, mid-30s, he guessed, and she was not what any of the women in that crowd would have called handsome. She carried a single large bag, and tucked under one arm, a heavy iron-bound chest that looked completely incongruous with the rest of her appearance, too large, too heavy, too serious for a woman stepping off a train into what was clearly supposed to be a fresh start. She stopped at the bottom of the train steps and looked at the crowd. She did not look frightened. That was the thing Silas noticed first, even through his own mortification. Most women, met with 60 people laughing at them before they'd said hello, would have shrunk, would have looked for a way back up those steps. Eleanor Ashcroft looked at this crowd the way a person looks at weather they've already decided to walk through. Then Charlie Briggs, apparently not satisfied with the response to his first remark, cupped his hands again. Better hope she can cook, Silas, because that's about all she's going to be good for. More laughter. Someone else, Silas couldn't see who, said something he couldn't catch but which made the group of women near the depot wall double over. He should have stepped forward. He knew it even as it was happening. He should have walked through that crowd and introduced himself and made it clear by his own demeanor that this was his family's business and not the town's circus. But something, shame, maybe, or that private man's instinct to go still under public scrutiny, kept him rooted where he stood. It was Hazel who moved first. She pulled her hand out of his without warning and walked forward through the crowd with the straightforward determination of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to be afraid of what adults think. People stepped aside for her. You do, when a small child walks toward you with purpose. And she came to stand in front of Eleanor Ashcroft with her dried-out wildflowers and her badly pressed dress, and looked up at her with the clear eyes that had always been her mother's greatest gift to her. "Are you my new mama?" she asked. The laughter didn't stop immediately. It takes a moment for a crowd to realize it's been interrupted by something more powerful than itself. Eleanor looked down at Hazel, and then she did something that Silas would think about for the rest of his life. She set that heavy iron chest carefully on the platform, lowered herself to one knee, which was not a graceful maneuver, and she clearly knew it, and brought herself level with his daughter's face. "I surely hope so," she said. "If you'll have me." Her voice was low and steady and utterly without performance. It was the voice of someone who meant exactly what they said and had stopped worrying about how it sounded. Hazel held out the wildflowers. "I picked these this morning. They dried out some." Eleanor took them with both hands like they were something precious. "They're beautiful," she said. And the extraordinary thing was that she didn't say it the way adults say things to children. That slightly elevated, slightly condescending register. She said it like she meant it, like dried-out wildflowers from a lonely little girl's fist were genuinely the most beautiful thing she'd been handed in a while. "I'm Hazel," said Hazel. "I know, I'm Eleanor. But you can call me whatever feels right to you. We'll figure it out together." Hazel considered this with tremendous seriousness. Then she took Eleanor's free hand in both of hers and turned back toward her father, pulling gently. The crowd had gone very quiet. Silas walked forward. He was aware of every pair of eyes on him, and he was aware that he had failed some test he couldn't quite name in the last 3 minutes. And he carried that awareness with him like a stone in his boot as he stopped in front of Eleanor and took off his hat. "Silas Granger," he said. She stood and looked at him evenly. "Eleanor Ashcroft." There was a pause. He didn't know what to say. What was there to say? with 60 people watching after what had just happened. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "About—" He gestured vaguely at the crowd, at Charlie Briggs, at all of it. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She had gray-green eyes, he noticed, the color of water in shallow creek beds. They were evaluating him without cruelty. "I'm going to need somewhere to put this chest," she said. "It's heavier than it looks." He took it from her. She was right. It was significantly heavier than it looked. "Wagons this way," he said. They walked through the crowd, Eleanor holding Hazel's hand, Silas carrying the chest, and the people of Caldwell Creek parted for them with the particular silence of people who aren't sure yet whether they've just witnessed something foolish or something important. Charlie Briggs made one more remark as they passed, something Silas didn't fully hear but caught the shape of. He stopped walking, set the chest down on the platform, turned around and looked at Charlie Briggs with the full weight of 3 years of hard living and genuine anger behind his eyes. "I didn't say anything. Sometimes you don't need to." Charlie Briggs found something else to look at. Silas picked up the chest and kept walking. The first 2 weeks were honest disasters. That was the most accurate word for them. Honest, because nobody pretended otherwise, and disasters, because they were. Eleanor could not cook on a wood-burning stove. She had cooked on a gas range, she explained without apology, when Silas found her standing over a pot of completely black beans on her third morning at the ranch. The distinction between a gas range and a wood stove was apparently significant enough to render her skills roughly useless, and she had the pragmatic self-awareness to say so directly rather than pretend. "I'll learn," she said, scraping the beans out. "I've got a fire to check," he said, and walked out, which was not his most gracious moment either. She couldn't manage the chickens. The chickens, which any woman in the county could have handled in her sleep, seemed to have developed a personal antagonism toward Eleanor specifically. The rooster, a bad-tempered animal named General Sherman by Hazel for reasons that were never fully explained, chased her across the yard on her 5th morning, and she came back inside with a scratch on her forearm and mud on her dress, and a look on her face that Silas had to turn away from so she wouldn't see him almost smile. She was slow at the washing. She got the proportions wrong on the cornbread twice before she got them right. She asked questions about ranch operations that revealed she knew almost nothing about cattle, horses, or frontier life in general, questions that weren't stupid, exactly, but that reminded him daily of the gap between what he'd needed and what had arrived. What he'd needed, if he was being honest with himself in those early weeks, was a woman who already knew how to do all of this. What had arrived was a woman who was going to have to learn it, and who seemed fully prepared to do so without complaint, and who was quite simply terrible at almost everything while the learning was happening. But here was the thing about Eleanor Ashcroft in those early weeks. She got up every single morning. He'd half expected, he realized later he'd been waiting for it, the morning she'd come to the table and say she'd made a mistake, that this wasn't what she'd expected, that she needed to go back east. That morning didn't come. She burned the beans and she scraped them out and she tried again. General Sherman chased her, and she came back inside, washed the scratch, and went back out to try to collect the eggs with a broom handle positioned between herself and the rooster. She failed at that too, but she went back out. Hazel, meanwhile, had developed an attachment to Eleanor with the speed and totality that only very young children or very hungry hearts are capable of. By the end of the first week, she was following Eleanor around the house with the focused attention of a small apprentice. By the end of the second week, she had declared that Eleanor made better bedtime stories than anyone, including her father, which Silas accepted as accurate without much resentment. The nightmares slowed down. He noticed that. Hazel had been waking 2-3 times a week since Margaret died, and it had been one of the things quietly tearing him apart, not knowing how to help her, not knowing what to say in the dark when she woke up crying for her mother. In the 3rd week after Eleanor arrived, Hazel only woke once. In the 4th week, not at all. He didn't say anything about it to Eleanor, but he noticed. What he didn't notice, because he wasn't looking for it, was what Eleanor did with her evenings. After Hazel was in bed, after the kitchen was cleaned, after the day's disasters had been cataloged and filed away, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and the ranch's account books and worked. He'd handed the books over to her on her 2nd day, more out of desperation than anything else, because he hadn't been able to make the numbers behave for 3 years, and he'd hoped a woman from the East might have some head for figures. Then he'd forgotten about it, because there were always 100 other things demanding his attention. He came in late on a Thursday night in her fourth week to find her still at the table with the books spread around her and three separate columns of figures written in her hand on a sheet of paper. She didn't look up when he came in. "Sit down," she said. "I need to show you something." He was tired, and he'd had a bad day with the cattle, and he didn't particularly want to sit down and look at account books. "Can it wait until morning?" She looked up then. The expression on her face stopped him. "No," she said quietly. "It really can't." He sat down. What Eleanor showed him over the next 40 minutes was methodical, clear, and devastating. She had gone back through 5 years of cattle sales records, cross-referencing the weights recorded by the buyer, a man named Hardin Doyle, who served as the county's primary cattle buyer and who had been the single most powerful economic figure in the region for a decade, against the mathematical patterns that should have appeared if the records were accurate. They didn't match. Not once. Not even close. "He's been shaving the weights," Eleanor said, pointing to a column of figures with a steady finger. "Not by a huge amount each time, maybe 3 to 4% per transaction. Small enough that any individual sale looks almost right. But over 5 years, across every ranch in this county that sold through him," she paused and looked at him. "Silas, he's stolen enough from you alone to cover 2 years of mortgage payments." Silas stared at the numbers. Then he looked up at her. "How do you know how to do this?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the papers. "I had a very good teacher," she said, and something in the way she said it closed the door on further questions. He should have pushed. He knew that later. There was something in that closed door that should have made him curious. But he was looking at 5 years of theft laid out on his kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, and the fury that was building in him took up most of the space available for other thoughts. "Doyle," he said. "Yes." "He does business with every rancher in this county." "I know." "If you're right about this, I'm right about this." He looked at her again. She said it without arrogance, the way a person states a fact they've checked 3 times and are completely certain of. Not the way someone performs confidence, the way someone has it. "There's a livestock auction in 2 weeks, he said slowly. "I know. I've been thinking about that. If we brought this to the other ranchers beforehand, we'd need to document it more thoroughly. Give me another week with these books, and I can give you something that no one can argue with." She paused. "There's something else." "What?" "He's not doing this alone. Whoever notarizes the sales documents, they have to be part of it. The records are too clean. Someone with legal standing has been helping him cover the numbers." Silas sat back. This was no longer just about his ranch. This was about every family in Caldwell Creek who'd been selling cattle through Hardin Doyle for the last decade, which was to say, nearly every family in Caldwell Creek. He looked at Eleanor across the kitchen table, surrounded by lamplit numbers and a week's worth of her careful work, and he realized that he had been making a fundamental error in how he thought about this woman. He had been measuring her against what she couldn't do. He had been watching her lose to the wood stove and General Sherman and the wrong-proportioned cornbread, and he had been categorizing her accordingly, as a woman out of her depth, as a failed match between what he'd needed and what had arrived, as a problem he was making the best of. He had not been paying attention to what she was actually doing. "All right," he said. "All right, what?" "Give it another week. Show me what you find." She nodded and looked back at the books. He sat there another moment, not quite ready to leave. The lamp threw soft light across the table and the papers in her steady hands moving across the columns of numbers, and outside the window the Texas dark was complete and absolutely silent. "Eleanor." She looked up. "I'm sorry I didn't step forward. At the station, when—" He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. "You've got a hard life out here, Silas, and this wasn't what either of us expected." She paused. "We don't have to pretend it was." It was, he thought, one of the most honest things anyone had said to him in years. He got up and went to bed, and he lay awake for a while thinking about dried-out wildflowers, and account books, and the weight of an iron chest, and the particular way a person's eyes looked when they'd already decided to walk through the weather, no matter what it brought. And in the kitchen, Eleanor turned back to the books and kept working. Because there were things hidden in those numbers that she hadn't shown him yet, things that couldn't wait much longer. And in the locked chest at the foot of her bed, other things waited, things that had followed her across 1,500 miles of country, things that certain men back east were already coming to reclaim, and the clock on all of it was running faster than Silas Granger knew. She gave it another week. She gave it 10 days, actually, because on the 8th day she found something that made her go back to the very beginning and check everything twice. Silas noticed she was sleeping less. He noticed because the lamp in the kitchen was still burning when he got up at 4:30 in the morning to start the day, and it had been burning when he'd gone to bed at 10. He didn't say anything about it the first time. By the third time he came downstairs in the dark and found her still at the table, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "You need to sleep. I need to finish this first." "Eleanor." "Silas." She looked up. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, and her hair had come partly loose from its pins in a way she clearly hadn't noticed. "When I'm done, I'll sleep. I promise. But if I stop now, I'll lose the thread of it, and this is too important to lose." He stood there a moment. I was a man who understood the pull of something that had to be finished before it could be set down. He'd spent enough nights in the barn with a sick animal to know that particular feeling. So he went to the stove, which he knew how to manage even if she didn't yet, and he made coffee, and he set a cup beside her without a word, and went back to bed. She drank it. She kept working. On the 10th day, she looked up from the table when he came in for the midday meal and said, "Sit down, I need to show you all of it." What she laid out over the next 2 hours was not just careful, it was ironclad. She had gone through every livestock sale record she could find going back 7 years. She had cross-referenced the recorded weights against the delivery manifests, against the railroad shipping documents that Silas had kept in an old tobacco tin without fully understanding their relevance, against the receipts from the feed suppliers whose records implied animals of specific average sizes. She had built a parallel set of numbers from the outside in, not just proving that Hardin Doyle's recorded weights were wrong, but proving mathematically what the actual weight should have been and documenting the precise gap between those two sets of figures across every single transaction. For Silas alone, the theft totaled just under $4,000 over 7 years. He sat with that number for a long moment. $4,000. In a county where most families were scraping to keep their mortgage current on a good year, $4,000 was the difference between a working ranch and a dead one. It was his wife's medical bills 3 times over. It was Hazel's entire future, sitting in a column of numbers that some man had been quietly pocketing across 7 years while Silas worked himself to the bone, trying to understand why the numbers never quite added up. "How many other ranchers sell through Doyle?" Eleanor asked. "Nearly all of them. Maybe 30 families. And he's been doing this to all of them?" "I can only prove your records," she said carefully. "But the pattern is consistent. The methodology doesn't change. It would be very unusual for a man to be this systematic with one seller and honest with everyone else." Silas's jaw was tight. "The auction's in 4 days." "I know. If we go to the other ranchers first, we need to. But we need to bring something they can't dismiss." She paused. "And we need to be careful about who we tell before we're ready. If Doyle gets word that someone's been through the records, he'll make it disappear. Or worse." She said it flatly, without drama, which somehow made it more alarming than if she'd said it with fear. She was a woman who had clearly thought about what worse looked like and was not pretending it was off the table. Silas looked at her across the stack of documents. "Have you done this before? This kind of work?" She met his eyes. "I'm good with numbers," she said. "I always have been." It was not an answer to the question he'd asked. He noticed that. But the auction was in 4 days, and there were 30 families who'd been robbed for years. And he set the question aside for later. He got up and went to find his horse. The next 3 days were some of the most tiring of Silas Granger's life, and his life had not been short on tiring days. He rode from ranch to ranch, hat in hand in the figurative sense, telling men he'd known for years that he had evidence their cattle buyer had been stealing from them. The reactions varied. Some men, the ones whose books were as bad as his had been, who'd spent years unable to explain why their figures never quite balanced, went pale and quiet and asked to see the proof. Some got angry at Silas first, which was easier than getting angry at Doyle, because Doyle wasn't standing in their barn. One man, Bill Casper, who ran a small operation north of town and had a temper that everyone in the county knew about, grabbed Silas by the collar before Silas finished his second sentence, and it took 10 minutes of careful conversation to get him to loosen his grip. But in the end, every man he spoke to came to the Granger Ranch on the morning of the auction to look at Eleanor's documents. They sat around the kitchen table, 12 of them, which was all the kitchen could hold, with another 8 standing in the doorway. And Eleanor stood at the end of the table and walked them through it. She was direct. She didn't soften it, didn't over-explain, didn't condescend. She put the numbers in front of them and showed them how to read what the numbers said. And she answered their questions with the patience of someone who has already thought of every objection and knows the answer to each one. It was the first time most of these men had been in the same room with Eleanor Ashcroft. A few of them had been on the platform the day she arrived. Silas watched their faces as she spoke, watched the moment each man's skepticism shifted, the moment the numbers stopped being Eleanor's claim and became simply the truth. And he felt something unfamiliar moving through his chest that he couldn't immediately name. Bill Casper, who had grabbed him by the collar 2 days ago, waited until Eleanor finished and then sat quietly for a long moment. 7 years, he finally said. At minimum, Eleanor said, possibly longer. 7 years is as far back as Silas's records go. How much from me? She found his page without hesitation. Based on the pattern and your sales volume, somewhere between $2,800 and $3,200. I can't give you an exact figure without your complete records. Bill Casper put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. His wife had died 2 years ago, and he'd almost lost the ranch last spring, and he had 2 boys in school who were wearing boots with holes in the soles because he couldn't afford new ones. Silas knew all of this. Everyone in the room knew all of this. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then an older rancher named Pete Dalton, who had about 20 years on everyone else in the room, and whose opinion carried weight accordingly, looked across the table at Eleanor and said, "Ma'am, what do you propose we do with this?" Eleanor had clearly been thinking about this. "We go to the auction as planned. We let Doyle conduct business as usual until he's committed to the day's records. Then we present the documentation publicly, in front of every buyer, seller, and witness in the county. And we give him one opportunity to produce his own records in response." She paused. "He won't be able to, because his records are the evidence against him. Every document he shows will only confirm what we've already proven." Pete Dalton nodded slowly. "And if he has friends in that crowd who decide to make it physical? That's why I'm suggesting we bring every man in this room, and I'd recommend leaving your guns at home. This needs to look like what it is, honest men presenting honest evidence, not a confrontation that he can frame as something else afterward." There was a murmur around the table. These were men who had grown up with guns as practical tools and who did not love being told to leave them behind. But the logic was sound, and they knew it. Pete Dalton looked at Silas. "Your wife put this together?" Silas nodded. Pete looked back at Eleanor with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite respect, but was trying to become both. "I'll be there," he said. One by one, the other men said the same. The auction was held at the Caldwell Creek Livestock Yard, which was a sprawling complex of pens and chutes on the south end of town that smelled precisely the way you'd expect and was always crowded on auction day with ranchers, buyers, hands, and the various merchants and hangers-on who gathered wherever money was changing hands. Hardin Doyle ran the operation from a raised wooden platform at the center of the yard. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a good suit and the easy confidence of someone who has been unchallenged for long enough to mistake that for permanence. He saw Silas arrive and nodded from the platform with the comfortable authority of a man who expects deference. He did not look at Eleanor. Men like Doyle rarely looked at women like Eleanor, which was one of the reasons she had been able to do what she'd done with his records. The morning went normally. Cattle moved through the chutes, weights were called, prices were set, hands were shaken. Doyle worked the platform with the practiced ease of a man in his element, and the numbers he called sounded exactly right to anyone who wasn't paying close attention to what they should have been. Eleanor was paying close attention. She stood to the side with her documents under her arm and watched every transaction, comparing what was called against what her calculations said the animals weighed. The discrepancy was there, consistent, every single time. 3% here, 4% there. Small enough to seem like the normal variation of imprecise measurement. Systematic enough to be something else entirely. She waited until midday, when the crowd was at its largest and Doyle had just completed the biggest transaction of the morning, a sale involving Pete Dalton's cattle that, by Eleanor's numbers, had been shorted by nearly $200 in a single transaction. She walked to the base of the platform. "Mr. Doyle," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Doyle looked down at her with the mild irritation of an important man interrupted by someone he considers irrelevant. "Mrs. Granger, isn't it? I don't believe I have business with you today." "You have business with every person in this yard," she said, "and I have some questions about your records." She heard the crowd shift, the sound of 30 ranchers and their hands moving closer, the way people move when they understand something is about to happen. Doyle's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "I'm afraid this isn't the time for Pete Dalton's cattle." She opened the top document and held it up. 43 heads sold this morning. You recorded an average weight of 812 pounds per animal. She paused. Their feed receipts from the last 3 months, combined with their documented size at spring branding, puts their average weight at closer to 845 pounds. That's a 33-pound discrepancy per animal. Across 43 head, that's over 1,400 pounds of cattle that Mr. Dalton sold this morning and didn't get paid for. Dead silence. Doyle's face had gone through several colors in quick succession. He settled on a particular shade of red that Silas, watching from 10 feet away, associated with men who were calculating their options. "The scales are certified," Doyle said. "Any variation is within normal." "I have 7 years of your records," Eleanor said. "The variation is never in the seller's favor. Not once. Not in 7 years. Not with a single rancher in this county." She looked up at him steadily. "What are the odds of that, Mr. Doyle, mathematically speaking?" The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Someone at the back of the crowd, Silas couldn't see who, said, loudly enough to be heard, "Let's see the records." Then someone else said it. Then several people at once. Doyle looked out at the crowd and saw something he had not apparently prepared for. 30 ranching families who had been losing money for 7 years and had just been handed a reason to say so out loud. He looked at Eleanor again, and for the first time his expression held something that was not irritation or dismissal. It was recognition. The particular look of a man who has just understood that he has badly miscalculated something. "I'll need time to—" "You have everything you need right here," Eleanor said. She set the stack of documents on the edge of the platform where he could reach them. 7 years. Every transaction, cross-referenced against shipping records, feed receipts, and branding documents. I've summarized the methodology on the cover page so that anyone with a basic understanding of arithmetic can follow it. She paused. "Or we can wait for your records and compare them directly. Your choice." Doyle did not reach for the documents. That was when Pete Dalton's voice came from the crowd, steady as stone. "Then I think we have our answer." What happened next was not tidy or triumphant. Real moments of exposure rarely are. Doyle tried twice more to reframe the situation. Once as a misunderstanding, once as a personal attack by a newcomer who didn't understand regional practice. And both times the crowd's response made it clear that the room had already made up its mind. 2 of his associates, men who'd been standing near the platform all morning, quietly left the yard before the conversation was finished, which told its own story. The local sheriff, a cautious man named Hayes who had known Doyle for 20 years and clearly found this day deeply uncomfortable, arrived at some point in the middle of it and stood near the edge of the crowd and listened for a long time before he said anything. When he finally spoke, he addressed Eleanor directly. "Ma'am, are you prepared to provide these documents for official review?" "I am," Eleanor said. "I have copies." Hayes nodded slowly. He looked at Doyle on the platform. He looked back at 30 families in his county who were watching him with the specific attention of people who have voted in 3 consecutive elections. "I'll be needing those records, Hardin," he said, "both sets." Doyle's face in that moment was something Silas would remember for a long time, not because it was dramatic, but because it was small. The face of a man becoming smaller than the space he'd occupied for years. The crowd walked out of that livestock yard different from how it had walked in. Not loud, not celebratory. There's nothing immediately celebratory about discovering you've been robbed for 7 years, but with the specific quality of people who have stopped carrying something they didn't know they were carrying. Silas walked beside Eleanor through the gate. Hazel, who had spent the morning with Pete Dalton's wife and had no idea what had just happened, ran up and took Eleanor's hand with the cheerful obliviousness of a child whose only concern is whether she'll get to ride home in the front of the wagon. Can I sit up front? Ask your father, Eleanor said. Daddy, can I? Yes, Silas said, without looking away from Eleanor. Eleanor glanced at him. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite exhaustion. Something more complicated than either, the look of a person who has just done something very difficult and isn't sure yet how to feel about what comes next. You did something today that most men in that yard wouldn't have had the nerve to do, Silas said quietly. I presented accurate numbers, she said. That's all. That's not all, and you know it. She was quiet for a moment. He was stealing from your family, Silas. From all of their families. She paused. I don't need nerve for that. I just need to be more angry than I am afraid. He looked at her. Are you afraid of things? Generally? She seemed to consider this genuinely, the way she considered most questions. Not performing humility and not performing confidence, just actually thinking about it. Yes, she said. More things than you'd probably guess. She looked ahead at the road. I just don't usually lead with it. He wanted to ask her what things. He was beginning to understand that the things Eleanor Ashcroft was afraid of were probably not the things most people would expect, and that understanding that might matter. But Hazel was pulling at both their hands now, asking questions about whether the horses were hungry and whether there'd be cornbread for supper, and the moment passed. The way moments do on an ordinary road on an afternoon that had been anything but ordinary. That night, after Hazel was in bed, Silas sat in the kitchen and watched Eleanor make cornbread. She had finally gotten the proportions right. It had taken 6 attempts, and she had not celebrated the first success so much as simply noted it and moved on, which he had come to understand was characteristic of her. And her movements at the stove were not yet comfortable but were no longer the movements of a person who expects catastrophe. She set the pan in the oven and turned around and found him watching her. What? She said. Nothing. I was just... He stopped. You were right, by the way, about someone with legal standing helping him cover the records. Hayes found a notary in the county clerk's office who'd been certifying falsified documents for 6 years. Eleanor nodded. She'd expected this. Who? Man named Garrett. Works for the county. Had been doing it for a percentage. Is he talking? Hayes says yes. Silas paused. Which means there might be more to find. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the oven. Then she looked back at him, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't read. Something careful. Something that had been carefully maintained for a while now. How much more do you think there is? She asked. The question was measured in a way that questions sometimes are, when the person asking already knows the answer and is deciding whether to tell you. He noticed that too. He was noticing more things about Eleanor Ashcroft as the weeks passed. The pauses before certain answers. The doors closed on certain questions. The heavy iron chest that still sat at the foot of her bed every night, and that she locked with a key she kept on her person at all times. He was a patient man by nature. 3 years of drought and dead cattle and raising a daughter alone had made him more patient still. He understood that some things had to be approached the way you approach a spooked horse. Not directly, not with force, but from the side and slowly, letting the animal decide when it was ready to be approached. But something was building. He could feel it. Something coming from the east, the way weather came from the east in this part of Texas, and he didn't know its shape yet. I don't know, he said, which was true. She nodded and looked at the oven again. The cornbread needs about 20 minutes, she said. He stayed at the table. She stayed at the stove. Neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Texas dark was the same complete silence it always was. But in the chest at the foot of her bed, behind a lock on a key she never took off, something waited that had followed Eleanor Ashcroft across 1,500 miles of country, and the men who wanted it back had not stopped looking. They were just now getting close enough to find her. It started with a stranger at the general store. Silas heard about it from Ruth Casper, Bill's sister-in-law, who worked behind the counter at Alderman's General and knew the business of everyone who walked through the door the way people do who serve a small town's daily needs. Ruth came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to bring a bolt of fabric that Eleanor had ordered 2 weeks before, and told Silas while Eleanor was inside with Hazel that 2 men had come into the store that morning asking about a woman named Eleanor Ashcroft. Eastern men, she said. City clothes, city manners, The kind of men who don't belong in a place like Caldwell Creek, and know it, and don't care. What did they want to know? Silas asked. Whether she was here, whether she'd come alone, whether she had anything with her. Ruth paused. Whether she'd married yet. Silas was very still. What did you tell them? I told them I didn't know any Eleanor Ashcroft. Ruth looked at him steadily. Which is technically true since the woman living at your ranch now is Eleanor Granger, far as I'm concerned. Ruth Casper was not a sentimental woman. She was the daughter of a cattle rancher and the sister-in-law of a man with a well-documented temper, and she had learned long ago to be practical rather than gentle. The fact that she had just lied to strangers on Eleanor's behalf was not a small thing, and both of them knew it. I appreciate that, Silas said. Don't appreciate it. Just tell me if I need to know something. He looked at her. I'm not sure yet what I need to tell you. She nodded once and left. Silas stood in the yard for a long time after she rode away. The afternoon was dry and too warm for October, and the light had that particular flat quality it gets when the air is very still. He could hear Hazel laughing at something inside the house, and Eleanor's lower voice responding to it, and the ordinary sound of those two voices together made the cold thing moving through his chest feel sharper rather than duller. He went inside. Eleanor was at the kitchen table with Hazel, helping her with her letters, a daily ritual that had developed naturally, with no announcement or arrangement, in Eleanor's third week at the ranch. Hazel was working on the letter H, tongue pressed to her upper lip in concentration, and Eleanor was watching her with the patient attention of someone for whom this particular moment was the most important thing happening. She looked up when Silas came in. She read his face the way he was learning she read most things, quickly, accurately, without making a production of it. Hazel, she said, go practice your H's at the window. I want to see if you can fill the whole page. Hazel, with the obliging trust of a child who does not yet know when she's being managed out of a room, took her paper to the window. Eleanor looked at Silas. What happened? He told her. He watched her face as he spoke, the way a person watches a face for what it does between the words. She listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment with her eyes on the table. Then she said very quietly, How long ago? This morning. She nodded. She looked at Hazel at the window, small and focused and completely unaware. Eleanor. He waited until she looked at him. I think it's time for you to tell me what's in the chest. She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, a horse shifted in the corral. Hazel's pencil scratched at the paper. Yes, she said finally. I think you're right. She got up. She went to the bedroom. He heard the key and the lock, and then the particular heavy sound of the iron chest being moved. When she came back to the kitchen, she set the chest on the table between them, and the weight of it on the old wood made a sound like something settling that had been unsettled for a long time. She looked at him across it. What I'm going to tell you, she said, is going to change what you think about me, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what you think. Silas put both hands flat on the table, the way a man does when he's bracing himself for something. All right, he said. She opened the chest. The chest did not open easily. Not because the lock was difficult. Eleanor had the key in her hand and turned it in one smooth motion. But because the lid itself was heavy, iron reinforced on the inside as well as the out, and it took both her hands to lift it. The kind of chest that was built not for convenience but for protection, the kind that had been made by someone who intended whatever was inside to survive a great deal of trouble. What was inside did not look like a fortune. That was the first thing Silas noticed. There was no gleam of gold, no dramatic spill of coins. There were papers. Stacked, organized, wrapped in oilcloth against moisture, bound with cord. Several leather folios. 2 smaller locked boxes nested in the bottom, each about the size of a large book. And underneath everything, wrapped separately in what appeared to be a lady's wool shawl, something that clinked with the specific weight of metal, when Eleanor carefully lifted it out and set it on the table. She unwrapped it. Gold coins. Not a fortune's worth at first glance, but enough. Maybe $200, maybe more, stacked in 4 small columns and nested in the center of the shawl, like she'd been traveling with exactly what she needed to survive and nothing more. Silas looked at all of it. Then he looked at her. Start at the beginning, he said. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table, looked at them for a moment, and then looked up with the expression of someone who has rehearsed this and is now, in the actual moment of it, setting the rehearsal aside. "My name is Eleanor Ashcroft," she said. "That part was always true. My father was Cornelius Ashcroft. He built the Ashcroft Continental Railroad, the line that runs from Cincinnati to St. Louis and branches south through Nashville." She paused to let that land. "He died 14 months ago. The official cause was heart failure. I don't believe that is what killed him." Silas said nothing. He waited. "My father had one sibling, a younger brother named Wallace. Wallace Ashcroft spent 30 years being his brother's business partner in name, while my father built everything of substance. When my father was alive, that arrangement suited Wallace well enough. He had access to the money, the social position, the clubs, and the dinners, and the deference that comes with being an Ashcroft in Philadelphia. But my father's will named me sole heir, not Wallace, not a board of directors. Me." She said it without pride, just fact. Wallace had known this for years. He contested the will within 48 hours of the funeral. On what grounds? On the grounds that I was mentally unfit to manage the estate. She said it in the same tone she'd used to announce the cornbread needed 20 minutes, completely level. He produced 2 physicians who testified that I suffered from a form of nervous disorder that rendered me incapable of making sound financial decisions. One of those physicians I had never met in my life. The other had examined me once, 6 years prior, for a respiratory illness. Silas's jaw tightened. Did they believe him? The initial court did, partially. She reached into the chest and removed the top leather folio, set it on the table. They issued a temporary order placing the estate in receivership pending a full competency hearing. During that period, Wallace was appointed interim trustee. She paused. Within 3 weeks of that appointment, several significant assets began to move. Property deeds transferred to holding companies whose ownership traced back to Wallace. Railroad securities reassigned to accounts I'd never seen before. My father's personal financial records, the originals, disappeared from the family attorney's office. He was stripping the estate. Yes, and doing it fast enough that by the time I understood what was happening, he had already moved approximately 40% of the liquid assets. Silas looked at the documents in the folio. Even without understanding their precise content, he could see they were dense. Legal language, numbers, signatures, seals. What's in there? The originals of everything he moved. She met his eyes. My father kept duplicate records. Not at the office and not with the attorney. At home, in a room that Wallace didn't know about, because Wallace hadn't been inside my father's house in 11 years. They barely tolerated each other by the end. My father kept Wallace close for business and at arm's length for everything else. She touched the folio. These are the property deeds, the original railroad securities certificates, the board resolutions, my father's personal correspondence documenting his intentions for the estate. And she reached back into the chest and removed a smaller, separately wrapped packet. A letter my father wrote and had witnessed by 2 independent notaries 9 months before he died, naming me, explicitly, detailing the estate, and expressing, in his own words, specific concern about his brother's intentions toward it. The kitchen was very quiet. Hazel was still at the window with her letters, but she'd gone still, the pencil stopped, the way children do when they sense a weight in a room without understanding its source. Silas looked at the packet, then at Eleanor. He knew. He knew Wallace well enough to prepare for him. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know if he knew it would kill him. It was the first time her voice had changed, just slightly, a thinning at the edges of the last 3 words, controlled back immediately. But it was there. Silas understood then that this woman had not simply come west to escape a legal dispute. She had come west carrying the grief of a man she'd lost, the anger of someone who believed she knew how she'd lost him, and the weight of documents that represented not just a fortune, but the last concrete evidence that her father had loved her enough to try to protect what he was leaving her. He was quiet for a moment. When did it turn dangerous? After the competency hearing was scheduled and I retained a new attorney, one Wallace hadn't already reached. His name was Thomas Carey, out of New York. Very good. Very thorough. She paused. 2 weeks after I retained Mr. Carey, someone broke into his office. His files were not the only thing taken. His clerk was beaten badly enough to spend a week in the hospital. She looked at her hands. Mr. Carey told me to leave Philadelphia. He told me to take whatever I had that was irreplaceable and go somewhere no one would think to look for me. And you answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride. It was Mr. Carey's idea, actually. He said it was the one category of movement that was essentially untraceable for a woman. No forwarding address required, no official record of destination, and no reason for anyone searching for an Ashcroft heir to look at the registry of a frontier bride agency in Pennsylvania. She almost smiled. He said to pick somewhere remote. Caldwell Creek qualifies. It does. This time she did smile briefly, and it changed her face in a way Silas was not entirely prepared for. I didn't know anything about you, only what you wrote in the letter. She looked at him. Most of what you wrote was about Hazel. He nodded. He remembered those drafts. That's why I chose your letter, she said simply. He sat with that for a moment, not with its implications for himself, he would get to those, but with the specific image of Eleanor, somewhere in Philadelphia, with a locked chest and a frightened attorney and men who had already put someone in the hospital, reading through a stack of letters from strangers who wanted wives, and choosing the one that was mostly about a 6-year-old girl's loneliness. The men at the general store, he said. They work for Wallace. Almost certainly. He has the resources to look indefinitely, and he knows I took the documents. Without these, she touched the folio. His transfers are nearly impossible to reverse. With them, his entire case collapses. She paused. And Wallace knows that, which is why 2 men in city clothes ended up in Caldwell Creek, Texas, asking about a woman named Eleanor Ashcroft. Silas looked at the chest, at the documents, at the 2 small locked boxes still sitting in the bottom that she hadn't opened. What's in those? She followed his gaze. The smaller one has the railroad securities, physical certificates, bearer instruments. Whoever holds them has legal claim to them until the ownership dispute is resolved in court. She paused. The other one has the deed to my father's house in Philadelphia, the deed to a property in Maryland that he bought the year I was born, and she stopped for just a fraction of a second. A portfolio of my father's personal investments in Western Railroad expansion that he made in the last 2 years of his life. Land grants, mostly, along proposed routes through territories that haven't been developed yet. Silas was quiet for a moment. He was a man who worked a ranch that had been fighting off foreclosure for 3 years, and he was sitting at a kitchen table across from a woman whose locked boxes contained enough paper wealth to buy everything in Caldwell Creek and have money left over for the next county. How much? He asked. Not greedily, just because he needed to understand what they were dealing with. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Mr. Carey's estimate, before he sent me away, was that the total estate, land, railroad holdings, securities, liquid assets, was somewhere between $3 and $4 million. The number sat on the table between them like a third presence. Silas exhaled. It wasn't quite a sound. It was the exhale of a man recalibrating something fundamental about his understanding of a situation. And you came here, he said, and you burned the beans and fought with the rooster and learned to make cornbread. She looked at him. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know you. She said it without apology, but also without hardness. And because I'd learned over the previous 8 months that telling people about the money changed what they saw when they looked at me. She held his gaze. I needed to know what you would see without it. Silas thought about the platform, the crowd, Charlie Briggs and his buffalo comment. He thought about himself, standing in the back of that crowd, holding Hazel's hand, feeling his face go hot with borrowed shame. I didn't pass that test, he said, at the station. No, she agreed, but Hazel did. A pause. And you passed some others since. He wasn't sure he deserved that, but he took it. What do we do now? She leaned back slightly, and for the first time since she'd opened the chest, she looked tired, genuinely tired, in the way that has nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with how long you've been carrying something. Mr. Carey knows where I am. He's building the case from the New York end, collecting affidavits, tracking the asset movements, documenting the forgeries. He told me it would take time. She paused. What I didn't expect was Wallace finding me this quickly. He hasn't found you yet. He's found the town. That's almost the same thing. She looked at the chest. If those men report back to Wallace that Eleanor Ashcroft is in Caldwell Creek, married to a rancher, he'll send something worse than 2 men in city clothes. Silas thought about what worse looked like in practical terms. men with different purposes than asking questions. He'd lived in Texas long enough to know what that category of problem felt like when it arrived. Then we need to move before he does, Silas said. Yes, but move how? Running again means giving up the ground we've established here, and the sheriff's cooperation, and the goodwill of every rancher in this county who now has reason to trust my word. She shook her head. Running served its purpose. It got me here with the documents intact, but I can't run forever and also fight Wallace in court, and eventually I have to do the second thing or the first thing never ends. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then we don't run. Silas, you walked into that livestock yard with 30 men who'd been robbed blind, and you put their money back in their pockets using nothing but arithmetic and nerve. He leaned forward slightly. These people know you now. Doyle's confession is going to go through Hayes and into the county records, which means your name is going to be in those records as the woman who brought it down. That's not a woman Wallace Ashcroft can quietly disappear. He paused. You've been fighting alone for 8 months. You don't have to anymore. Eleanor looked at him. Something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to control. Not weakness, nothing like weakness, but something that had been pressed down for a long time and was responding to the specific pressure of being told it didn't have to hold the weight alone. She looked away. You don't know what you're taking on. I know what I'm looking at, he said. I know what my daughter calls you. He stopped. I'm not telling you it's going to be simple. I'm telling you that you're not standing in it by yourself. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the afternoon was going gold, and Hazel had fallen asleep in the window seat with her paper full of H's still in her hand, the way children do when the day has been long enough and no one told them to stop. Eleanor looked at Hazel. Something in her expression was so unguarded that Silas felt he was seeing something private, the face of a woman who had spent 8 months making calculated decisions and was now sitting in a kitchen looking at a sleeping child and feeling something that wasn't calculation at all. All right, she said quietly. All right. She looked back at him. I need to get a letter to Mr. Carey. Immediately. He needs to know I've been found, and he needs to accelerate whatever he can from the New York end. If we're going to stand our ground here, he needs to have the legal framework moving fast. I can have someone ride to the telegraph office in the morning, not Charlie Briggs's office. Definitely not Charlie Briggs's office. She almost smiled again. There's a telegraph station in Marfa, 60 miles, but I know a man who'll make that ride. Pete Dalton owed him, and more relevantly, Pete Dalton was the kind of man who understood that some things needed to be done without being talked about afterward. Eleanor nodded. She began carefully returning the documents to the chest. Her hands were precise and practiced. This was not the first time she had packed and repacked those papers, had checked and rechecked the oilcloth wrappings, had made sure every document was exactly where she needed it to be. The habit of a woman who had been living with the knowledge that she might need to reach any given paper in a hurry. There's one more thing, she said, without looking up from the chest. The men at the store. They asked if she'd married yet. Not whether she was here, not whether she had documents, whether she'd married. Silas understood immediately. Because a married woman has different legal standing. In some jurisdictions, a woman's property reverts to her husband upon marriage, which would complicate the ownership claim. She closed the chest and looked at him directly. Wallace may argue that because I married under what he'd call fraudulent circumstances, hiding my identity, concealing the estate, the marriage itself is invalid. If he can establish that, I'm back to fighting alone without the legal protections that marriage provides. Can he establish it? He can try. Whether he succeeds depends on how the court reads the circumstances. She paused. And on whether anyone in this county is willing to testify that they know me as Eleanor Granger and believe our marriage to be genuine. Silas thought about Ruth Casper saying the woman living at your ranch is Eleanor Granger, far as I'm concerned. He thought about Pete Dalton and 12 men at his kitchen table. He thought about Hazel's H's on the paper in the window seat. That won't be a problem, he said. She nodded. She put her hand on the chest lid for a moment, not moving, as if she was checking through it that everything inside was still there. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked up. The 2 men at the store today. Neither of them is going to stay around without sending word. How long do we have before Wallace knows you're here? Eleanor was quiet. If they sent a telegram today? A week. Maybe less. She paused. If they ride back to the nearest major city and post a letter, 2 weeks. She met his eyes. Either way, the next thing that comes won't be men asking questions. What will it be? Men with legal papers, forged warrants. Wallace has been doing this long enough to have people who fabricate them convincingly, possibly men with other purposes alongside. She said the last part carefully. My father's attorney in Philadelphia, not Mr. Carey, the original family attorney, was found dead 6 months ago. Ruled an accident. He was the one who held the original copies of the will. Silas looked at her steadily. You should have told me sooner. I know. She held his gaze without flinching. I was afraid of what you'd do with it. What did you think I'd do? She considered this honestly. Send me away, or... She paused. Decide the trouble wasn't worth it, and look for a way to exit the arrangement cleanly. He thought about that. He thought about whether 3 months ago, before the account books and the auction, and Hazel sleeping in the window seat with her paper full of H's, whether 3 months ago he might have done exactly that. He was honest enough with himself not to be certain. I'm not going to do that, he said. I know that now, she said. And the way she said it, not with relief exactly, but with the quiet weight of someone updating a belief they'd held for practical reasons and no longer need, told him that whatever she had seen in the last 3 months had mattered. That however inadequate he'd been at the station, and in the first weeks, and in the various moments where he'd been a stubborn private man struggling with a situation he hadn't chosen, something in it had added up to something she trusted. That was not a small thing. He understood that. He stood up. I'm going to ride to Pete Dalton's tonight. Eleanor looked at the window. It was going dark outside now, the gold flattening out to gray. It's almost evening. Pete Dalton's used to people showing up when they need something. He reached for his hat. And I need him to ride to Marfa in the morning. He was almost to the door when she said his name. He turned around. She was still sitting at the table, her hand still resting on the chest. She looked at him with the gray-green eyes he'd first noticed at the station. Water in a shallow creek bed, he'd thought then. And in the lamp-lit kitchen with Hazel asleep in the window seat and the whole weight of what she'd just laid out on the table between them, she said, "Thank you." It was not a grand statement. It was 2 words that she said the same way she said most things, directly, without performance, meaning exactly what she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, went out into the dark. He made the ride to Pete Dalton's in 40 minutes and told him what he needed without telling him why, because Pete was the kind of man who didn't require reasons from someone he respected. Pete agreed to ride at first light, asked no questions, and poured Silas a glass of something that wasn't quite whiskey, and offered it in the particular way of frontiermen who express concern through practical gesture rather than words. Silas rode home through the complete Texas dark and unsaddled his horse and stood in the corral for a moment looking up at the sky, which was the way he thought through things when there was too much to think through for a kitchen or a bedroom. He thought about $3 million sitting in an iron chest at the foot of a bed in his house. He thought about what that number was supposed to mean to him, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it meant less than he would have expected. It was a problem, in the sense that it was a target. It was a complication, in the sense that it brought men in city clothes asking questions in the general store, but it was not. And he checked this carefully because it seemed important to check. It was not something that changed what he thought when he looked at Eleanor Granger. He thought about dried-out wildflowers and black beans scraped into the yard, and a woman on one knee on a train platform in front of a laughing crowd, giving his daughter the first genuine answer she'd received about whether she was going to be all right. He thought about 10 days of burning lamp oil and a week of careful, brilliant work that had given 30 families back a piece of what they'd lost. He thought about the expression on her face when she said, "I was afraid of what you'd do with it." He went inside. The kitchen was clean, the lamp turned low. Eleanor had gone to bed. The chest was behind her locked door. He sat at the kitchen table in the near dark for a few minutes, the way he did sometimes when the day had been too much to simply sleep off. On the table was Hazel's paper. She must have put it there before going to bed, with her full page of H's in careful, crooked 6-year-old rows, and at the bottom of the page, in a different hand, neat and precise. Very good, Hazel. Every single one. Silas looked at it for a long time. Then he went to bed. He slept 4 hours before the sound woke him. Not a loud sound, which was what made it alarming. A soft sound. A careful sound. the specific sound of someone who did not want to be heard moving across the yard in the dark. He was at the window before he was fully awake. Two shapes at the edge of the property, moving toward the barn. Not running, not furtive in the obvious way. Moving with the deliberate casualness of men who'd been told to check something and were trying to look like they belonged. He pulled on his boots and his coat and took the rifle from above the door. He was not a man who frightened easily, but the thing he felt as he moved through the dark toward the barn was not quite fear and not quite anger. It was something colder than either, the specific feeling of a man who has just fully understood that a problem is real and is now dealing with it in real time instead of in the abstract. The two shapes saw him when he was still 20 feet away. They stopped. "Pretty," Silas said. His voice was low and entirely steady. One of the men started to say something, some explanation, some cover story. He could hear the shape of it forming in the half-second before the man spoke. Silas didn't let it land. "I know why you're here," he said, "and I want you to hear me carefully." He stopped. "Let the dark and the silence do some of the work. You go back and tell whoever sent you that Eleanor Ashcroft is Eleanor Granger now. She's a married woman in Caldwell Creek, Texas, and this county knows her name. Whatever you came here to do tonight, you won't accomplish it without this entire county knowing about it by morning." He paused. "You need to decide whether that's the kind of attention the man who sent you wants right now." The two men looked at each other. He could not see their faces clearly in the dark, but he could read posture, and what he read was men recalculating. The one who'd started to speak said, carefully, "We were just looking around." "I know what you were doing," Silas said. "Go." They went. He stood in the dark of the yard and watched them move back toward the road, unhurried but not slow, the walk of men performing the fiction of leaving voluntarily. He stood there after they were gone, the rifle in his hand, the Texas night completely quiet around him. When he turned back to the house, Eleanor was standing in the doorway. She had a lamp. She was looking at him with an expression that was complex enough he couldn't read all of it from across the yard, but the part he could read was not surprise. She had known they might come. Of course she had. She had spent 8 months knowing what kind of men her uncle sent and what they came to do. She had spent 8 months sleeping lightly enough to hear them. And she had come to the doorway with a lamp instead of staying behind a locked door, which meant something about her that he was still working out the dimensions of. He crossed the yard to the house. She stepped back to let him in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "How many?" "2. The same ones from the store, I think." She nodded. Her jaw was set in the way he recognized as her holding something in. "They'll report back. Wallace will know by the end of the week." "I know." She looked at him. The lamp threw shadows that made her face harder to read, but her eyes were steady. "It's going to get worse before it's resolved." "I know that too." "You could still—" "Eleanor." He said it quietly, but with enough weight that she stopped. "Stop offering me the exit. I'm not looking for it." She was quiet. The lamp between them flickered once, a draft from somewhere, the house settling, something. "All right," she said, and then, because she was Eleanor and she was practical even in the moments that weren't, "I'll need to add something to the letter to Mr. Carey in the morning. He needs to know they've made physical contact. I'll tell Pete before he rides." She nodded. She looked past him toward the dark of the yard, at the road where the two men had disappeared. Her expression was not fear. It was the look of someone doing the mathematics of a situation. How much time, which moves, what comes next. Whatever she was calculating, it was clear she wasn't calculating alone anymore. She turned back into the house. He followed her in and bolted the door behind them. The iron chest sat locked in the bedroom, full of the evidence that would either save everything or bring the full weight of a very powerful man's desperation down on a ranch in Caldwell Creek, Texas. And somewhere on a road outside town, two men were riding toward a telegraph office to send a message east that would set the rest of it in motion. Pete Dalton made the ride to Marfa in 5 hours flat, which was faster than Silas had asked and exactly what the situation required. The telegram to Thomas Carey went out before noon. By the time Pete was back in Caldwell Creek that evening, saddle-sore and short on conversation, the message had already crossed 4 state lines on its way to a law office on the 14th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan, where a very good attorney was about to have a very bad day turn into a very purposeful one. Silas didn't know any of that yet. What he knew was that he had 6 days, maybe 7, before whatever Wallace Ashcroft decided to send arrived in Caldwell Creek. He spent those days the way a man prepares for weather he can't stop, not by trying to prevent it, but by making sure everything that mattered was secured before it hit. The first thing he did was talk to Sheriff Hayes. Hayes was not a man who liked surprises, and the conversation in his office on the morning after the two men had come to the yard was not comfortable for either of them. Silas laid out enough of the situation to be useful without laying out more than Hayes needed. The estate dispute, the forged documents Wallace had used, the likelihood that men with legal papers of questionable authenticity were coming. Hayes listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. And when Silas finished, the sheriff sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "You're telling me your wife is the Ashcroft Railroad heir," Hayes said finally. "I'm telling you my wife is Eleanor Granger, who has documents proving her legal claim to an estate currently being disputed in the courts." Hayes looked at him. "That's a careful way to say the same thing." "It's the accurate way." Hayes was quiet for another moment. "These men who come with the warrants, you think the warrants are forged? I think there's a strong possibility. And if I act on a forged warrant, you'd be participating in the theft of a woman's legal inheritance and potentially obstructing a federal fraud case that her attorney in New York is currently building." Silas paused. "I'm not threatening you, Hayes. I'm making sure you have information you'd want to have before you make a decision." Hayes looked at him for a long time. Then he looked out the window at the main street of Caldwell Creek, where the ordinary business of an ordinary Thursday was proceeding without any awareness of what was coming. "How much time do I have to think about this?" "Less than a week?" "Wonderful." Hayes picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down with a sound of mild disgust. "All right. I'm not going to act on papers I haven't had time to verify. I can drag that verification process out a few days if I need to." He met Silas's eyes. "A few days? That's what I can give you." "That might be enough." "It better be," Hayes said, "because after that I have a legal obligation regardless of what I personally think, and you know it." Silas nodded. It was honest, and it was fair, and it was exactly what he'd expected from Hayes, which was why he'd come to Hayes first. The second thing he did was more complicated. Eleanor had spent the previous 2 days composing the most comprehensive version of her father's letter, Thomas Carey's instructions included, and had also written out, in her precise hand, a full summary of every document in the iron chest, cross-referenced against the legal claims that Wallace's attorneys had filed in Philadelphia. The idea was that if the chest was ever taken from her by force, there would be a complete record elsewhere of what it contained, authenticated by someone other than Eleanor herself. That someone was Pete Dalton. Pete came to the ranch on the third evening and sat in the kitchen while Eleanor walked him through the document summary with the same methodical patience she'd used at the livestock auction. Pete was not an educated man in the formal sense, but he was not a foolish one either, and he asked 3 questions during the explanation that told Silas he was following all of it. When Eleanor finished, Pete looked at the summary she'd prepared, 12 pages, dense and precise, and then looked up at her. "You want me to hold this?" "In your strongbox, yes. And if men come here and take the chest, then you have an independent record of its contents, notarized by a witness who is not a party to the estate dispute, held in a separate location, that can be used by Mr. Carey to reconstruct the evidentiary record." She paused. "It's not a perfect solution, but it makes the chest less valuable as a target if taking it doesn't actually eliminate the evidence." Pete Dalton was quiet for a moment. He looked at Eleanor in the way he'd looked at her at the livestock auction, the look of a man revising his assessment of someone in real time. "My wife said to tell you she's sorry she wasn't more welcoming when you first arrived," he said abruptly. Eleanor blinked. It was the only time Silas had seen her caught genuinely off guard by something social. Please tell her that's not necessary." She felt bad about laughing at the station. Pete said it plainly, the way Pete said most things. "She wanted me to mention it." There was a brief silence. Eleanor looked at the table. "Tell her I understand," she said, "and that I appreciate it." Pete nodded, took the 12 pages, put them inside his coat, and went home. Eleanor sat at the table for a few minutes after he left, not doing anything, just sitting. Silas made coffee and set a cup in front of her and didn't say anything, because he'd learned enough about her by now to know when words were useful and when they weren't. After a while, she picked up the coffee. Pete Dalton's wife cried when she found out how much Doyle had taken from them, she said, not quite looking at him. Ruth Casper told me. She said Mrs. Dalton sat down on her kitchen floor and cried for an hour. Silas nodded. I keep thinking about that, Eleanor said, about all the things those families went without because of those numbers. She was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about what I could... She stopped. He looked at her. What? She shook her head slightly. Later, she said, when this is resolved. She picked up the coffee again. There are things I want to do with this county if I come out of this with what's mine. Things that aren't about me. She said it carefully, like she was still working out whether she was allowed to say it yet. Wells, a school that's better than what Hazel has now. A clinic. There's no doctor within 40 miles, and I know what that costs people out here because I know what it costs Silas. She stopped again. He had not told her about Margaret's death in any detail, but Eleanor had clearly put together enough of the shape of it, from Hazel's nightmares, from the particular quality of Silas's silences on certain subjects, to understand that the 40-mile distance to medical care was not an abstract problem in this house. You don't have to earn the right to be here, he said. She looked at him. Whatever you want to do with the money, when this is over, that's your choice. And it's the right choice. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether you've justified yourself to this town. He paused. You already did that at the livestock yard. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the coffee. I know, she said. I just... A small exhale. I'm not used to having someone tell me that. He didn't know what to do with that, so he went to check the barn, and she let him go. And neither of them made it into something larger than it was, which was perhaps, he thought, walking across the dark yard, what being actually known by another person looked like, as opposed to being managed or performed at. It was not always comfortable, but it was real. The wagon arrived on a Wednesday. Not men on horseback, not the dramatic arrival Silas had half expected. A hired wagon from the Marfa stage line, pulling up in front of Hayes's office at 9 in the morning, carrying 3 men in good suits and a document case that one of them held the way people hold things they consider very important. Silas found out about it within 20 minutes because Bill Casper saw the wagon from the feed store and sent his boy running. He went to Hayes's office alone. Eleanor stayed at the ranch with Hazel, which had taken some convincing. She'd wanted to come, and her reasons were good ones, but Silas's reason was better. If the papers were genuine and Hayes had no choice, Eleanor at the ranch bought time that Eleanor at the sheriff's office would not. The 3 men were in Hayes's office when Silas arrived. He knew one of them by type immediately, a Philadelphia lawyer, the kind who wore his education like a suit of armor and spoke to anyone outside a major city with the particular patience of someone explaining things to a slow child. The other 2 were quieter, and the way they stood told Silas they were not attorneys. The lead attorney's name was Harcourt. He had papers from a Philadelphia court declaring Eleanor Ashcroft mentally incompetent and ordering her return to the custody of her appointed guardian, Wallace Ashcroft, pending final resolution of the estate. He also had what appeared to be a warrant for the recovery of property, specifically documents and securities alleged to have been taken fraudulently from the Ashcroft estate. Hayes read through all of it at his desk while Harcourt stood across from him and Silas stood near the door, and the 2 quiet men stood near the window looking at nothing in particular. The office was very still. Hayes finished reading. He set the papers down carefully. These are from a Philadelphia court, he said. A federal court, Harcourt corrected. Jurisdiction extends. I know what federal jurisdiction is, Hayes said without heat. I'm noting that these papers were issued in Philadelphia and I am in Texas, and that the process of verifying federal documents issued by a distant court takes time. Harcourt's expression did not change, but something behind it tightened. The documents are legitimate. The seals are... I can see the seals, Hayes said. I'll need to verify them through the proper channels. That process takes 3 to 5 days. Sheriff, it's the law, Hayes said, which I assume you, as an attorney, appreciate. He looked at Harcourt with the specific patience of a man who has decided what he is going to do and is waiting for the other person to understand that it is decided. You're welcome to make yourself comfortable in town while we complete the verification. There are 2 boarding houses on the main street. I'd recommend the one at the north end. Better food. Harcourt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. Then he picked up his document case and left, followed by the 2 quiet men, and the sound of the office door closing was almost polite. Hayes looked at Silas. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. And then I have to act. I know. Whatever's coming from New York better move fast. I know that too. Is your wife safe at the ranch? Silas thought about the 2 quiet men who'd just walked out of the office. She will be, he said. He was not entirely certain of that, which was why he stopped at Bill Casper's on his way home and had a 10-minute conversation that resulted in Bill and 2 of his hands riding out to the Granger Ranch that afternoon and installing themselves, without particular announcement, in the vicinity of the barn. Eleanor watched them arrive from the kitchen window. When Silas came in, she looked at him and he said, Bill Casper owes me a favor. And she looked back out the window at Bill's big frame moving toward the barn and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The telegram from Thomas Carey arrived the next morning. Pete brought it out from town himself, arriving before breakfast, and the expression on his face when he handed it to Silas said that he'd read enough of it to know it mattered. Silas took it inside and set it on the table, and Eleanor read it standing up, still in her coat from having been out to fight General Sherman for the eggs, and her expression went through several things in the space of 30 seconds. He has the affidavits, she said, from the 2 physicians Wallace paid. One of them recanted. She looked up. He signed a sworn statement 6 weeks ago saying he was paid to provide false testimony about my competency. Silas felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for days. Can Carey get that to Hayes in time? He's already sending it by wire to the federal marshal's office in San Antonio, and, she read further, her eyes moving fast, the notary in Philadelphia who authenticated the forged will transfer. He's in custody. He's been talking for 2 weeks. She stopped. She set the telegram down on the table very carefully, as if her hands weren't entirely steady, which he'd never seen before. Eleanor. The transfer documents Wallace used to move the railroad securities, she said. The ones I said were forged. The notary confirms it. He was paid $6,000 to stamp documents he knew were fraudulent. She looked at Silas. That's not a civil matter anymore. That's criminal fraud on a federal scale. He understood what that meant before she said it. Wallace's legal strategy falls apart. His legal strategy, his criminal exposure, his ability to make any credible claim to the estate. She stopped. If Carey can get that to San Antonio fast enough, how fast is fast enough? Before Hayes is forced to act on Harcourt's papers, before those men in the boarding house decide waiting isn't working. She was already moving toward the desk in the corner, reaching for paper and pen. I need to write to Carey again. He needs to know about Harcourt, about the timeline Hayes gave us, about... She was writing before she finished the sentence, the pen moving with the focused speed of someone whose mind was running faster than her hand. Silas looked at her for a moment, coat still on, hair coming loose, writing at a ranch desk in Texas about documents in Philadelphia that were going to determine the fate of a $3 million railroad empire, and thought about the platform in Caldwell Creek and Charlie Briggs, and the Buffalo comment, and all the ways a person could look at something and see absolutely the wrong thing. He went to saddle a horse to take the letter to town. The attack came on the 3rd night. He should have anticipated it. Looking back on it afterward, and he spent a great deal of time looking back on it afterward, the signs were there. The 2 quiet men from Harcourt's party had not been seen in town since the first day. Harcourt himself had sent a message to Hayes's office the previous afternoon, citing new information and suggesting the verification could perhaps be expedited, which was the language of a man whose plan was moving off the tracks and who was running out of patience. What Silas had not fully calculated was what a man like Wallace Ashcroft, who had already been connected to 1 suspicious death and multiple counts of criminal fraud, would authorize when his legal approach was failing. The storm had been building since afternoon, the kind of fast, rolling Texas thunderstorm that comes on with very little warning and hits with everything at once. By 9 o'clock, the sky was doing things that made the horses uneasy, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. Bill Casper's hands had moved from the barn to the bunkhouse, which Silas had told them to use, and Bill himself was inside playing cards with no particular urgency, because the storm had made it seem like a quiet night. It was not a quiet night. Silas heard the cattle before he heard anything else. That specific shift in the sound of a herd, the change from the low, restless noise of animals unsettled by weather to something louder, more urgent, more directional. He was at the window in 4 seconds and out the door in 6. What he saw from the top of the porch steps stopped his blood. The western pasture fence was down, not broken by weather, down in a line, methodically, the way fencing goes down when men cut it. And through that gap, in the strobing light of lightning that was coming fast and close, he could see the herd moving, not drifting, moving with the specific terrible momentum of animals that have been deliberately frightened into a run, a stampede. Several hundred head of cattle moving east, toward the ranch buildings, toward the house. He heard Bill Casper shout something behind him from the bunkhouse door. He heard his own horses reacting in the corral. He was already running for the corral gate to get a horse, any horse, thinking about angles of approach and whether he could get ahead of the herd, and thinking about the house behind him where Eleanor and Hazel were. He did not make it to the corral. The ground near the gate was wet from the leading edge of the storm, and he'd known that section of corral fencing was soft-posted since July and had meant to fix it and had not gotten to it. And when he grabbed the gate post and used it to pivot fast, the post gave way and he went down hard, and the corral fencing came with him, and the horses inside spooked at the commotion, and one of them, his own horse, the big roan he'd had for 7 years, came through the gap and caught him on the way out. Not a direct kick. A glancing blow from a hoof that caught his left leg below the knee and spun him down into the wet dirt, and the pain was the specific white pain of something that was either broken or very close to it, and the roan was gone into the dark, and the sound of the stampede was growing. He tried to get up. His leg held his weight for 2 seconds, and then didn't, and he went down again against the remains of the corral fence. And for a moment that was both very short and very long. He was on his hands and one knee in the mud with the lightning coming fast, and the thunder right behind it, and the ground beginning to vibrate with the approach of several hundred terrified cattle. He could not get out of the way. He understood this with the specific clarity that emergency produces. Not panic, just fact. The herd was coming through the gap that had been his corral gate. He was 20 feet from that gap on the wrong side of it, and his leg was not going to carry him 20 feet in the time he had. He heard Eleanor before he saw her. Not a shout. She didn't shout. What he heard was the sound of the barn door, the big sliding door on the south side that was heavy enough to take real effort, going back fast on its rail, and then the sound of hooves on the barn floor, and then on the yard dirt, and then Eleanor was out of the barn on his gray mare. Not saddled, no time for a saddle, just Eleanor on the mare's bare back with nothing but the halter rope for guidance. And she was between him and the corral gap before he had fully processed that she was moving. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the gap, and on the darkness beyond it, where the sound was coming from, and she turned the mare sideways in the gap, and she did something he had never seen a person do with a horse they barely knew and no saddle and a stampede 30 seconds away. She held. The mare was terrified. He could see it from where he was. The animal's body was every muscle clenched at once, ears flat, weight shifting, every instinct screaming to go anywhere that was not toward that sound. And Eleanor, who could not manage the chickens 6 weeks ago, who had come to this ranch knowing nothing about frontier life, sat on that animal and held it in the gap with nothing but her weight, and her legs, and whatever she said to it that he couldn't hear over the thunder. Bill Casper was there then, coming from the side, and one of his hands from the other direction, and they were moving to help get Silas clear, and Silas was not paying attention to any of that because he could not look away from Eleanor in the corral gap. The herd hit the fence line 60 yards out and split, not all of it. The front of it came through other gaps further north, and the sound and the chaos and the rain that started then, in genuine earnest, made the next 10 minutes something that Silas would never be able to reconstruct in exact sequence. But the gap where Eleanor held the mare was where the largest part of the herd had been heading, and she held it long enough for the flow to break around her, and the cattle that came through on either side, rather than directly over the spot where Silas had been. Bill Casper had him up and back against the barn wall before the worst of it came through. His leg was wrong, and the pain was significant, and he couldn't have moved himself, but Bill moved him. And he watched from against the barn wall while 300 cattle went past in the rain and lightning, and Eleanor on the gray mare held the gap until there was nothing left to hold. Then the mare finally had enough and went sideways, and Eleanor came off. She hit the ground in the mud to the side of the gap rather than in front of it, which was the difference between a fall and something much worse, and she did not get up immediately. Silas pushed off the barn wall on one leg, and Bill grabbed his arm, and Silas said something that was not a word, and pulled free and covered the 20 feet to where Eleanor was in the mud on the 3-point basis of 2 hands and 1 leg. She was already pushing herself up when he got there, mud from the hairline down on one side. Her left hand was scraped bad, the kind of scrape that comes from going down fast on wet dirt and gravel. She was breathing hard, and her expression when she looked up at him was the expression of someone taking inventory of their own damage and finding it less than expected. "I'm all right," she said before he said anything. "You came off a horse. I'm all right." She looked at his leg. "You're not. It's Silas." Her voice was level in the way it was level when she'd walked to the base of Hardin Doyle's platform. "Your leg is wrong. Don't tell me it's fine." He looked down. In the lightning flash, he could see what she meant. It was not fine. Bill Casper was there. One of his hands. The rain coming down now in the serious way Texas rain came down when it committed, soaking everything in seconds. Eleanor got up. Not gracefully, she needed Bill's hand to make it, and he could tell from the way she moved that the fall had cost her something in her ribs or her shoulder. And then she turned around and helped Bill and the hand get Silas to the porch. They got inside. Hazel was at the top of the stairs in her nightgown with huge eyes, and Eleanor said, "Come here, sweetheart," and held her arm out, and Hazel came down the stairs fast and pressed herself against Eleanor's side, and Eleanor held her with the arm that wasn't hurt and didn't say anything else, just held her while the rain hammered the roof, and outside Bill and his hand started the work of dealing with the aftermath. Silas sat on the bench by the door with his leg out in front of him, soaking wet and covered in mud, and in enough pain that sitting still required active effort, and he looked at Eleanor, who was also soaking wet and covered in mud, and holding a 7-year-old girl and managing her own pain with the same contained practicality, she managed everything. And he thought about what he'd just watched her do. She had ridden out on a bareback horse into the path of a stampede. She had done it in the dark, in a storm, on an animal she barely knew, with no equipment and no plan except to put herself between the cattle and her husband. He thought about the train platform. He thought about 60 people laughing and himself standing in the back of the crowd letting it happen. He thought about what it had cost him to be that man and what it would cost him to keep being him. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him over Hazel's head. "After this is over—" He stopped. He was not a man who said these things easily. She knew that. "I'd like there to be an after," he said, "with you." She looked at him for a moment with those gray-green eyes that had been evaluating him since the first day, that had been taking his measure against the circumstances and finding him sometimes wanting and sometimes not. She looked tired and wet, and her ribs were clearly hurting, and there was mud on her face, and she was still holding his daughter like it was the most natural thing she'd ever done. "There already is one," she said. "We're in it." He nodded. His leg was very bad, and the storm was still going, and somewhere out in the dark night 2 quiet men from Harcourt's party had just committed something that was no longer in the category of legal dispute. But the house was solid around them, and Bill Casper's boots were loud on the porch outside, and Hazel's breathing had slowed against Eleanor's side from frightened to almost asleep. "We'll need to send for Hayes in the morning," Eleanor said. "The men who drove that herd need to be found before they leave the county. And if we can connect them to Harcourt, we can connect them to Wallace." "Yes." She shifted Hazel slightly against her side and winced with her ribs and didn't mention it. "And that changes everything about those papers Harcourt brought. You cannot present forged warrants to a county sheriff while simultaneously directing men to commit criminal mischief in the same county. Even a Philadelphia judge has to draw a line somewhere." Silas looked at her. "You're already thinking about the next move." "I've been thinking about the next move since the herd started running," she said. Outside the rain eased slightly, not stopping, just pausing for breath the way Texas storms did. In the quiet between one wave and the next, the house felt very solid and very particular, the specific solidity of a place that had just been tested and held. Eleanor looked at him with Hazel asleep against her side, and she said, "We're going to be all right, Silas." He believed her. Not because she said it the way people say things to comfort, which she didn't. She said it the way she said everything that she was certain of, as a fact that had been checked and rechecked and was going to hold. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes against the pain in his leg, and the rain came back down, and the house held, and morning was coming whether Wallace Ashcroft was ready for it or not. Morning came gray and wet, with the particular exhausted quality that follows a bad storm. The sky wrung out, the ground torn up, everything that had been loose now settled into wherever it had landed. Silas's leg was broken. Not badly. By the assessment of the doctor, Bill Casper rode 40 miles to fetch, which meant it was broken in the specific way where a man could still function if he was stubborn enough, which Silas was. The doctor set it, bound it, told him to stay off it for 6 weeks, and looked at him with the expression of a man who knows his instructions are going to be partially ignored. He also looked at Eleanor's ribs, 2 bruised, possibly 1 cracked, wrapped them, told her the same thing about rest, and received the same expression back. Bill Casper watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway with the look of a man who finds something both exasperating and deeply familiar about 2 people being told to slow down and refusing in unison. Hayes arrived before the doctor left. He came in the front door with his hat in his hand and mud on his boots, and the look of a man who had already been up for several hours making decisions he wasn't going to enjoy. Behind him were 2 of his deputies, and unexpectedly, a man Silas had never seen before. Tall, weathered, wearing a badge that was not Hayes's county badge. "Federal Marshal," Hayes said by way of introduction. "Marshal Cord Reeves, out of San Antonio. He arrived this morning." Hayes looked at Eleanor. "Apparently your attorney in New York has been busy." Eleanor looked at Reeves. "Thomas Carey contacted you?" "His office contacted the federal marshal's office 4 days ago," Reeves said. He had the economical manner of a man who deals in facts rather than impressions. "We've been in communication since. The documents he forwarded, the recanted physician's affidavit, the notary's confession, the fraud documentation, were enough for us to open a federal investigation into Wallace Ashcroft." He paused. "As of yesterday, Mr. Ashcroft has been detained in Philadelphia pending arraignment on charges of criminal fraud, forgery, and conspiracy." He looked at Eleanor directly. "The competency order has been vacated. The warrant Harcourt brought to this county is void." The kitchen was completely still. Hazel, who was at the table with her breakfast, looked up at the silence, and then looked at Eleanor, and then looked back at her food with the focused unconcern of a child who doesn't understand exactly what has happened but can read from the adults' faces that it is significant. Eleanor did not cry. She did not collapse, did not make a sound of relief, did not do any of the things that the moment might have seemed to call for. She sat very still for about 4 seconds, and then she said quietly to Reeves, "The 2 men who drove the cattle last night." "We have 1 in custody," Reeves said. "The other was found this morning by Bill Casper's hands on the North Road. He'll be brought in today." He paused. "They're talking, both of them. They were hired through an intermediary in Marfa, but the money traces back to an account controlled by Harcourt's firm, which traces back to Wallace." "He ordered it," Eleanor said. "It was not a question." "That's what the evidence suggests." "Yes." She nodded. She put both hands flat on the table, the way Silas had seen her do when she was steadying herself through something. Not performing calm, just finding it the way you find your footing on bad ground. "And Harcourt?" "Being interviewed in Hayes's office right now," Reeves said. "He claims he had no knowledge of the stampede plan. That may or may not be true. We'll determine that." His expression suggested he had opinions about Harcourt's claim that he was keeping professionally to himself. Hayes spoke then, from the doorway. "There's one more thing." He looked at Silas, and then at Eleanor, and then back at Eleanor. "The 2 men who came to your yard the other night. After last night, they came forward on their own. Walked into my office at 6 this morning and gave full statements." He paused. "They said they were hired to locate you, to determine whether the documents were here. And—" he stopped for a moment. "They said their instructions included that if retrieval wasn't possible, other measures were to be taken." The room was quiet, in the way that rooms get quiet, when something is said out loud that everyone had already understood, but not yet named. "Other measures," Silas repeated. "Yes." Silas looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was looking at Hayes with the gray-green eyes that never gave more away than she chose to give. And he thought about a night 14 months ago when a man named Cornelius Ashcroft had died of what was recorded as heart failure. "Will that be part of the federal case?" Eleanor asked. "It's being looked at," Reeves said carefully. "I won't make promises about outcomes, but it's being looked at." Eleanor nodded once. She looked at Hazel, who had finished her breakfast and was now drawing something on the back of her spelling paper, small and absorbed and completely present in the way of children who belong somewhere. Eleanor watched her for a moment with an expression that Silas had learned in the months since she'd arrived, was the one she wore when something was so large she couldn't contain it in her face. "Thank you," she said to Reeves. "Both of you." Reeves nodded and left with Hayes. The door closed, and the kitchen was just the three of them again, which had come to feel, over the past months, like a complete thing. Hazel looked up from her drawing. "Is it over?" Eleanor looked at her. "The hard part," she said. "Yes. Is that why you're making that face?" "What face?" Hazel considered her with the unsettling accuracy of a 7-year-old. "The face like when you're trying not to cry, but you're also not sad." Eleanor put her hand over Hazel's on the table. "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly what this face is." Hazel seemed to find this satisfactory. She went back to her drawing. Silas watched Eleanor's hand on Hazel's and did not say anything at all because there was nothing to say that would have improved the moment, and he had learned that about moments. The legal resolution took 4 months. That was the number Carey gave them when he arrived in person in Caldwell Creek 3 weeks after the marshal's visit. A compact, precise man of about 50 who looked around the ranch with the expression of someone recalibrating his mental image of a situation, and who spent 2 days going through every document in the iron chest with Eleanor at the kitchen table, while Silas, leg in a splint, sat at the other end and drank coffee, and occasionally answered questions about the timeline of Eleanor's arrival and the events at the livestock yard. 4 months, Carey said, was optimistic but achievable. The criminal case against Wallace would move faster than the estate case. The fraud charges were well documented, and the testimony was solid. The estate case was more complex because unwinding 4 months of fraudulent asset transfers required court orders in multiple jurisdictions. But the core claim, Eleanor's inheritance, was not in serious dispute anymore. The forged documents had been traced, the paid witnesses had recanted, and Wallace's own notary had given the federal investigators enough to reconstruct the entire fraud from the inside. "You'll get it back," Carey told her on his last evening at the ranch, over Eleanor's cornbread, which had, somewhere in the past 2 months, become genuinely good. "Not all of it immediately. Some of the assets will take time to recover. But the railroad holdings are secure, the property deeds are clear, and the personal accounts he liquidated. Most of those were moved into trackable instruments. We'll recover the majority." Eleanor looked at him across the table. "What about my father?" Carey was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man, and he chose his words the way careful men do. Not slowly, but precisely. "The investigation into your father's death has been reopened by the Philadelphia authorities. The federal case gives them grounds they didn't have before. Whether that results in a charge of homicide depends on what they find." He paused. "I won't tell you it's certain. I will tell you that it's being taken seriously by people with the authority to do something about it." Eleanor nodded. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she picked up her fork and finished her supper and asked Carey about his journey back to New York, and the conversation moved on, and Silas watched her manage the grief of that particular unanswered question, the way she managed most hard things. Not by pretending it wasn't there, but by not letting it eat the rest of the meal. Carey left the next morning. Pete Dalton came to return the 12 pages of document summary Eleanor had asked him to hold, and he brought his wife, who had apparently decided that the way to address her embarrassment about the train platform was to arrive with a pie and direct eye contact, and Eleanor received both with more grace than the situation strictly required. The 4 months passed. The way months pass when a great deal is happening in the background of ordinary life, faster than expected, marked by ordinary days and then sudden news. The rhythm of a situation resolving itself in the legal world, while the people it concerned got up every morning and fed chickens and fixed fencing and helped a 7-year-old with her letters. Silas's leg healed, Eleanor's ribs healed. General Sherman the rooster remained terrible, and Eleanor remained in a state of armed truce with him that had evolved, over time, into something that might generously be called mutual respect. She still could not manage him without the broom handle. She had stopped apologizing for this, and he had stopped noticing it. In the 3rd month, a letter arrived from Thomas Carey with documents for Eleanor to sign, the formal reestablishment of her ownership of the primary Ashcroft Continental Railroad holdings, executed through the federal court. She sat at the kitchen table and signed them with the same pen she used for the ranch accounts, and when she was done, she set the pen down and sat for a moment looking at the signatures. "That's it?" Silas said. "That's most of it." She folded the documents back into their envelope. "The property deeds come separately, and the personal accounts will take another month. She looked at him. But the railroad is mine again. He nodded. It was a simple thing to say for something so large, but Eleanor had always had that quality, the ability to say large things in simple sentences, without inflation, which made them land heavier rather than lighter. What now? He said. She looked at him. Well, she said, I've been thinking about the wells. He smiled. It was not a thing he did easily or often, and she had learned to notice it the way you notice something that doesn't come frequently. She looked at him when he did it, briefly, the way you look at something that you're glad is real. How many? He said. At least 4 in the first year. There are 3 families in the eastern part of the county who are hauling water more than 2 miles in dry season. That's not sustainable, and it doesn't have to be. She had a piece of paper, he noticed. She always had a piece of paper, with figures on it. The school is more complicated. The building itself is straightforward, but finding a qualified teacher who will come out this far is going to take time. I've written to 2 normal schools in Austin. We'll see. And the clinic? I have a letter from a doctor in San Antonio. Young man, just finished his training. He's interested. She paused. He has conditions. Such as? He wants a proper building, not a converted barn. He wants guaranteed patients, which, in a county without medical care for 40 miles, is not an issue. And he wants a small salary until the practice can sustain itself. She looked at the paper. All of that is manageable. Silas looked at her. She was sitting at the kitchen table where she had first shown him Doyle's stolen numbers, where she had opened the iron chest, where she had written letters to Thomas Carey and composed document summaries for Pete Dalton and made her first batch of cornbread that was actually edible. And she was talking about wells and schools and clinics for a county that had laughed at her on a train platform less than a year ago with the focused practicality of a woman who has decided what she's going to do and is working out the sequence. You know this county is going to have opinions about all of this, he said. They always do. She didn't look up from the paper. They'll have better opinions when they have clean water and a doctor. He thought about Bill Casper's hands in boots with holes in the soles. He thought about Mrs. Dalton crying on her kitchen floor for an hour. He thought about Hazel's nightmares and the 40 miles to the nearest medical care and what those 40 miles had cost this family specifically. What can I do? He said. She looked up then. The question seemed to land differently than she expected, not because it was surprising exactly, but because of how simply he said it. Not what do you need or how can I help, both of which have a slight distance in them. Just, what can I do? As if whatever the answer was, it was already in the category of things he was doing. She looked at him for a moment. Come with me when I talk to Pete about the well sites, she said. He knows this land better than anyone, and he'll listen to the plan better coming from both of us. All right. And, she paused, the doctor from San Antonio. He'll need somewhere to stay while the clinic is being built. I told him we had room. Silas looked at her. You told him we had room before asking me. I was fairly confident. Eleanor. You were going to say yes. He had been going to say yes. You could have asked. I'm telling you now. You're telling me after. She looked at him with the expression that was almost a smile, and had been almost a smile for the last 6 months, and that he had come to understand was, for Eleanor, equivalent to a full grin on most people. Are you going to say no? He was not going to say no. She knew it, and he knew it, and the fact that this particular dynamic had become entirely normal in his house, in the space of less than a year, was something he thought about occasionally when he was out in the pasture alone, not with distress, but with the particular quality of wondering how things that seem impossible before they happen seem so inevitable once they're real. No, he said. Good. She looked back at the paper. The wedding had been legal from the day it was performed, but in the spring, after the legal resolution was complete, after the 2 men who'd driven the cattle pled guilty to criminal mischief and were sentenced after Wallace Ashcroft was convicted on 6 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, Eleanor and Silas had a second ceremony. It was Eleanor's idea, which surprised him. She was not a sentimental woman in the conventional sense. She did not collect things or make occasions out of ordinary moments or require her feelings to be performed publicly. But she said, one evening in February while Hazel was asleep and the fire was down to coals, that she would like to do it again, properly. with the people who knew them. The first one was necessary, she said. I'd like one that's ours. He understood that. He said yes immediately, which was not always his instinct, but was, in this case, the right one. They did it under the big oak at the eastern edge of the property, on a Saturday in late April when the Texas spring was doing everything it could with what the drought years had left to work with, which was not nothing, and looked, in the particular slant of April light, like enough. Pete Dalton came, and his wife, who had by now become something that was tentatively moving toward friendship with Eleanor in the way of two practical women who have decided to stop being awkward and start being useful to each other. Bill Casper came and stood with his arms crossed in the way that Bill did at events that moved him, which was to say, immovably. Ruth Casper came and brought food. Several of the other ranching families came, the ones who'd been in Silas's kitchen that morning, and a few who hadn't but who had heard enough by now to want to be there. Hayes came. Even Hayes came, standing at the back with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who is glad a situation resolved the way it did. Hazel walked Eleanor to the oak tree. She had asked to do this herself. In the serious way, she asked for things she'd already decided on. She had a new dress. Eleanor had made it, which had been its own weeks-long project involving several failures, and one afternoon where Eleanor sat with a seam ripper for an hour and said something under her breath that Hazel immediately asked her to repeat, and Eleanor immediately declined to, and she held Eleanor's hand the whole way from the porch to the tree with the focused solemnity of someone who understands they are doing something important. At the tree, before the small crowd, Hazel looked up at Eleanor and said, clearly enough for everyone to hear, "Hi, Mom." Not a planned thing, not something she'd been told to say. Just Hazel, being Hazel, saying what was true. Eleanor took a breath. One breath, just the one, with the quality of something large moving through a narrow space and coming out the other side. Then she looked down at Hazel and said, "Hi, sweetheart." Whatever else the ceremony contained, the words, the vows, Silas's hands, and Eleanor's hands, and the April light through the oak leaves, that was the center of it. Everyone there knew it. Silas would not say it was the happiest moment of his life, because he did not traffic in superlatives, and because he understood by now that happiness was not a moment but a direction, and the direction had become clear enough over the past year that he trusted it going forward. But he would say, if asked, that it was the first time in 3 years that the future felt like something to move toward rather than something to survive. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. The iron chest sat in the bedroom of the ranch house for 2 more months while the last of the estate documents were finalized. Then Eleanor moved it to the small office she'd set up. There was a room that had been used for storage that she'd quietly claimed over the winter, filling it with the account books she'd taken over entirely and correspondence she maintained with Thomas Carey and with the bank in Austin where the recovered assets were being consolidated. The gold that had been in the chest went to the bank. The securities and property deeds went to Carey's office for safekeeping. The legal documents went into a proper filing cabinet that Pete Dalton built from leftover barnwood because he said he didn't like the idea of the woman who'd gotten his money back from Hardin Doyle keeping her papers in a box on the floor. What remained in the chest, after all of that, was less orderly but more permanent, Hazel's drawings. There were a great many of them by now. Horses and houses and figures that were identifiable as Silas and Eleanor and General Sherman, only if you squinted, and Eleanor had kept them all, stacked carefully in the bottom of the chest, because she did not know yet how else to keep things that mattered, and the chest was what she had. Letters. The ones from Thomas Carey, yes, but also a letter from Pete Dalton's wife that had 3 sentences and no proper punctuation, but that said, in its entirety, that she was glad Eleanor had come and that the county was better for it. A note from Bill Casper that had 2 sentences and also no punctuation, which said he was sorry he hadn't stopped Charlie Briggs at the station and that he ought to have. A letter from the young doctor, now 2 months into his San Antonio correspondence, who had enclosed a photograph of himself outside a building and written on the back, "Future Clinic, looking forward to it." And a letter, found in the chest when Eleanor finally went through all of it, found tucked in the back corner under the oilcloth, where it must have been since before she packed the chest in Philadelphia, in her father's handwriting. She found it on a Tuesday evening in June. Silas was outside. Hazel was in bed. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands for a long time before she opened it. It was not a long letter. Her father had not been a long-letter man. It said that he knew she would find a way through whatever came, because she always had. That he was sorry he could not stay to see it. That what he was leaving her was not the railroad or the property or the money. Those were tools, he wrote, not gifts. But the knowledge that she had come from people who built things that lasted and that she would do the same. That he had believed this about her from the time she was small enough to sit on his desk and reorganize his accounting files by a system that was more logical than his own, which had always made him laugh. That was where the letter ended. Not with a formal closing, just with that, the image of a small Eleanor reorganizing her father's papers, and the man who found that worth remembering in the last letter he wrote. She sat with it for a long time. Silas came in from outside and saw her at the table and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He didn't say anything because he could read the shape of the moment. He went to the stove, which he had always known how to manage, and made coffee, and set a cup beside her without comment. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet, which was the first time in a year he had seen that. "From my father," she said. He nodded. He sat down across from her and put his hands around his coffee cup and let the silence hold what the silence was for. After a while, she folded the letter and held it in both hands and said, "He would have liked you." "Would he?" "He liked people who didn't perform," she said, "who said less than they meant and did more than they said." She looked at her coffee. "He didn't have much patience for the other kind." "Sounds like someone else I know." She looked at him with the almost smile. "He was better at it than I am." "I don't think so." She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm and June dark outside the windows, and somewhere upstairs Hazel was making the small sounds she made in deep sleep, which Eleanor had learned to distinguish over the months from the sounds that meant nightmares, which had become rare enough now that they startled her when they came. "I keep thinking about what I was looking for," Eleanor said. "When I answered your letter, I told myself it was safety, a place no one would look for me." She paused. "But I think I was looking for proof that there was a life that valued something other than what I had in that chest." He looked at her across the table. "I found it," she said. Not to him exactly. Just saying it, the way you say things that you've needed to say out loud for them to be real. "I found it in a place I didn't expect, with a man who almost didn't step forward at a train station and a little girl who did." He thought about that. About the version of himself who had stood in the back of the crowd and let 60 people laugh and had not moved. He did not entirely like that man, which he thought was probably appropriate. You shouldn't entirely like the version of yourself you were before you were better. "I almost didn't deserve it," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you grew into it." She said it without cruelty, which made it land without cruelty. That's what matters. Not where you start. What you do when you understand what's being asked of you. He sat with that. Outside, a June bug hit the window screen and fell away into the dark. The horses were quiet in the corral. Somewhere to the north, across the pasture that was coming back after 3 drought years, a coyote said something brief and was not answered. The iron chest in the bedroom was almost empty now. The gold was gone, the securities were gone, the legal documents were gone. What it held instead was small and unimpressive and worth nothing to anyone who didn't know what it meant. Drawings and letters and notes, and one photograph of a building that didn't exist yet. Silas had heard somewhere that you could tell what a person valued by what they kept. He thought about that sometimes, about the men who'd come from the east looking for gold and documents and had found a woman who was more dangerous than either. About a county that had laughed at a woman on a train platform and had found itself transformed by her. About a 6-year-old who had walked through a crowd of adults with dried wildflowers in her fist and had seen clearly what everyone else was too busy performing to notice. About himself, standing in the back of that crowd. And then, gradually, not standing there anymore. Eleanor put the letter in the chest, on top of Hazel's drawings. She looked at Silas across the table. "Come to bed," she said. "You have fencing to check in the morning, and so do I." He almost laughed. "You're checking fencing now?" "I've been checking fencing since March. You've been too busy being impressed by yourself for getting through the winter to notice." He did laugh then. A real one. Not managed. The kind that comes out before you decide to let it. She looked at him when he did it with the expression he had come to understand was her version of the same thing. They went to bed. The chest sat in the corner of the room with its iron sides and its heavy lock, and all the small evidence of a life that had turned out to be something neither of them had come looking for, and both of them had found anyway. Not a perfect life. Not the life either of them would have designed from scratch. A real one, which is always more complicated and more durable than the ones we plan. In the morning, Hazel came downstairs and found them both already in the kitchen. Eleanor at the stove, which she now managed without incident except on the days the wood was green. Silas at the table with the account book she'd reorganized last winter. Hazel stood in the doorway in her nightgown and looked at the two of them in the morning light and said, with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once doubted that the ground would hold, "Is there cornbread?" "There is," Eleanor said. "Good." Hazel sat down. "Mom, can we go see the well today? The new one?" "After your letters," Eleanor said. "I did my letters yesterday." "Then you can do more today." She set the cornbread on the table. "Letters every day, Hazel. That's the arrangement." Hazel looked at Silas with the expression of someone seeking a coalition partner. "Don't look at me," Silas said. "She's right." Hazel sighed with the profound resignation of a child whose adults are aligned against her, and picked up her cornbread, and outside the June morning was doing what June mornings did in Texas, which was arrive with complete commitment and no apology. Eleanor sat down at the table between them. The ranch that had been dying 3 years ago was not dying anymore. The clinic would open in the fall. The school would break ground in October. The first 4 wells were in. Hardin Doyle had pled guilty and was awaiting sentencing. Wallace Ashcroft was in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, and the men he'd sent west were in a county jail, and Thomas Carey was in New York methodically recovering the last of what had been taken. None of that was on the table at breakfast. What was on the table was cornbread and account books, and a 7-year-old conducting negotiations about well visits and letters, and the particular quality of ordinary morning light in a house that had found its way to being a home. Some fortunes are measured in what a chest contains. This one was measured in what had been taken out of it, the gold and the securities and the legal instruments that had served their purpose and been sent on, and what had been put in instead: drawings, letters, small evidence of people being known by each other over time. That was what Silas Granger had found when the train came in and the crowd laughed and a woman in a plain green dress set down a heavy iron chest and got on one knee in front of a lonely little girl. Not the fortune he'd expected, the one he'd needed.